Hi, Brian. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Brian? Can't hear you yet.
How about now? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay.
And hi, everybody else who's joining us. We are just waiting to get our guest, Micky ScottBey Jones, on the call, and we will start with all of you shortly. Hey, Micky, can you hear us?
Hello, I can.
All right, great. So we are going to do this live on Facebook.
Gareth, it looks like we're live on Facebook.
I think we are. Just as they did in the ancient days when Lent began, we're live on Facebook. Hi, everybody. I'm Gareth Higgins, and I'm an Irish writer, and at the moment I'm on the South Carolina coast. Let's introduce ourselves.
Go ahead, Micky.
Hi, my name is Micky ScottBey Jones, and I'm the Justice Doula. And I am just outside of Nashville, Tennessee, in a little town called Spring Hill. What else should I say about myself? Is that good enough for now?
That may be good for now, yeah.
Okay.
And I'm Brian McLaren. Happy to be with everybody. I live in Southwest Florida, where today the temperature was 83. And everyone's in a panic because tomorrow it will only go up to 72. That's the cold wave.
Oh, the life dilemma.
Well, it's good to see you both, and thanks everybody for joining us tonight. You know that you're here at the beginning of this Lent series. Lent officially begins tomorrow, but the project that we're discussing, exploring together, is called The Seventh Story, and in order to do 7 Tuesdays, we started the day before Lent, and I'm going to dive right in. We're going to be here for about 45 minutes exploring this question of how the stories we tell shape our lives. Brian introduced me to an idea that has radically changed my life just over a couple of years ago. It's one way of looking at the world, and we're just offering it as an experiment. There's lots of other ways of thinking about the world, but the way we're exploring for this series is called the seventh story, the idea is simple, that human beings have evolved 7 different stories to make sense of our lives, to bring about peace and security. 6 of them we're all extremely familiar with, and the 7th waiting in the wings. Very simply what these 6 previous stories are. The first is the domination story. That's the idea that we bring about peace and security by ruling over others. The Roman Empire or Darth Vader, or even the way some employers run their businesses, or the way some people dominate their families. The second story is a reaction to the domination story, and that's the revolution story. And that's, I'm going to bring about peace and security by overthrowing you, and then I'll dominate you. The third story is what we call the purification story. That's the story that says the problems in the world are not my fault. They're your fault. They're the fault of some other group. And the way we will bring about peace and security is by purifying ourselves of that group, either by building big barriers around ourselves to keep them out, or worse, exterminating them. And even if it's just character assassination, I think most of us have participated in that in some way. And many of us have been targeted by some form of purification narrative. The fourth story is the isolation story. That's the story that says, I don't want to be here in this messy world, so I'm going to go and look for a promised land, maybe a wilderness or a desert or an island where I can build a utopia. And of course, the history of utopias is that they start dominating each other and having revolutions pretty quickly. That's the isolation story. The fifth story is what we call the story of victimization. And that's when I live out of my wound before it has had some time and support to heal, to repair itself. And I define myself in terms of what was done to me, and really in opposition to people who remind me of the people who did those things to me. Entire nations have been built on the victimization story. And then the sixth story is the accumulation story, which really just says, after I've tried all these other ones, I'm just going to buy a bigger sofa or a bigger house, or what the hell, I'll invade a country and take it. These are what we call the 6 default oppositional stories. You probably recognize them. Maybe you've lived them. Maybe you've been taught them, even taught them as virtues. And we think it's time for those stories to give way to the 7th story of liberation and reconciliation. And that's why we're here for these next 7 Tuesdays. That's the kind of prologue. And I'm going to hand over to Brian to do a little ritual with the candle and to lead us into the next part of this conversation. We are going to try, by the way, as this conversation goes on, to follow when you comment on Facebook or in the Zoom call. And there will be a part during the call where we'll try to respond to some of your comments and questions.
Thanks, Gareth, for that overview. For so long, people have found that the act of lighting a candle is a way of, in some ways, presenting our own humble little wick, our humble little body of wax that's so fragile, and to open ourselves up and say that we need some light to come to us, and we want ourselves to receive that light, and we might even dare to hope that if that light can live in us, we could shine it. And that's our hope during this season of Lent. I wanted to give a little bit of biblical background to the domination story, and especially in the season of Lent. Lent begins, there's so many different ways to describe Lent, but one way to describe it is it begins with us contemplating our own mortality. That's in many ways what Ash Wednesday is about. We contemplate our own mortality, and then it takes us through to an act of murder on Good Friday, and then challenges us with the possibility of resurrection on Easter Sunday. Now, in history, Lent has been used in a whole lot of different ways, and some of them not all that admirable. You know, if we can make you be afraid of dying and afraid of going to hell after you die, then we got you for 7 weeks, and we can really get you on Holy Week. You know, so there's a lot of ways that it's been abused, but I hope what we can do in these 7 weeks is help make the most of Lent by actually focusing on some of the bigger biblical picture and the stories that Gareth mentioned earlier. You know, I grew up fundamentalist, so I grew up with hearing about the Bible all the time, but the actual historical and social political context of the Bible was never important in the entire way I was raised. It was the Bible was kind of, we were suspended between the past and then a future either in heaven or hell, and history just was kind of you know, just a distraction really in this fallen world. But many years ago when I was a pastor and I actually had to preach from the Bible, I realized, gosh, there's an awful lot of politics and an awful lot of history, and so much is going on there. And the backdrop to that history was what we're calling the Domination story. If you ask any Jewish person what the primary story in the Hebrew scriptures is, they will tell you it's the story of Exodus. And if you've never thought about it this way, the Exodus story is the story of the Egyptians in the position of domination, exploiting slaves. Now, I know it's very hard to imagine a nation growing rich by the exploitation of other people, but just imagine that it happened sometime in the distant past. And so this domination story where a 1% or a 0.001% or 5% or 10%, where some minority gets unimaginably rich compared to everyone else by exploiting their labor and by exploiting the land that those people depend on. And so this amazing, audacious claim is made in the Hebrew scriptures. And that is that when the creator of the universe looks at the world with all of its pyramids of power, with a few at the top and many at the bottom, that the creator of the universe doesn't legitimize this hierarchy, but rather hears the cries of the people at the bottom and is willing to upset the pyramid to bring liberation to the people at the bottom. And so this domination story is really in the backdrop of everything. And in this season of Lent, when we're thinking about and preparing ourselves for the story of Jesus' final week, the domination story is there in the background too. Just a couple of quick events in the story of Jesus leading up to Passion Week. In Matthew chapter 16, there's a really interesting thing that happens. Jesus takes the disciples on a field trip. It's one of only 2 times that Jesus leaves his basic home territory. And both are really interesting. But in this one, he takes the disciples to a place called Caesarea Philippi. This would be like going to, you know, Trumpville or something, because Caesar is the leader of the domination narrative, and Philip is somebody who works with Caesar. And so Caesarea Philippi is basically domination city. It's the Pentagon, and it's Washington, D.C., and it's, you know, every military base and every political center all wrapped up into one. And they go there, and Jesus has a conversation with the disciples. He says, "Who do people say that I am?" And you'll recall in the story, Peter said, well, the different disciples say, "Oh, people say you're this and this and this." And then Peter says, Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Now, we hear that and think of all kinds of religious things if we think of anything at all. But if you think of the word Christ, Christ means the anointed one. Who was anointed? A king was anointed. So to say Jesus is the anointed one is to say, in a sense, you are the revolutionary king. You are the liberating king. We're being dominated by a king named Caesar and his puppet Philip. And there was Herod and others in this hierarchy. But you're the one who's going to liberate us from those others. And then when he says Son of the living God, it helps if you know that Caesar was called the son of the God, of the gods. And so that in a sense sets off this drama of two different kingdoms, one promising liberation and the other dealing domination. Fast forward to Holy Week, where we'll be in 7 weeks, and we're going to see Jesus standing before Pilate, and Pilate's trying to intimidate Jesus the way every representative of a domination system is, and Pilate's part of this, near the top of this hierarchy in that region. And you might recall Jesus and he have some interchanges, and he basically says, look, I have power. Don't you realize how much power I have? And Jesus says, I'm here to bear witness to the truth. And then Pilate says, what is truth? And in Pilate's world, you see, the only truth is power. Now, again, I know it's very hard to imagine political leaders who don't care about the truth, who would lie back and forth, who treat the truth like it's worth nothing. All they're really interested in is power. I know it's hard for us to imagine such a world, but that's what's going on in the backdrop of the story. And again, here's someone who says, I actually do care about the truth, standing up to someone who has traded away the truth for power. And in that way, in some ways, the way you start to confront the domination system is you simply tell the truth about it. You tell the truth about its violent past. You tell the truth about its deceitful present. And you tell the truth about its doomed future, because pyramidal structures like that can't last forever. One last thing. When we reach Good Friday itself in the Lenten journey, I don't know if you've ever thought of it this way before, but the greatest power of a dominating regime is the threat of death, of torture and death. If we can torture you and make you afraid, if we threaten you with death, then you will stay under our power. Our friend Shane Claiborne sometimes says, something people don't realize about Easter and resurrection is the biggest problem with resurrection is that it's illegal. In other words, if the power of a domination system is to kill you, and you aren't afraid of death, and you don't think death is the end, in a sense, you see through the power of the domination system. And that willingness to see through the power of the domination system, not let it be in control, I think is the beginning of our Lenten journey, to just see through it, to know that it's not the only way things have to run, to be willing to say, this is about power, not about truth, to not expect people in the domination system to tell the truth, but to realize they're just playing a different game entirely. And if we want to live by a seventh story, not the domination story, we're going to start by caring about the truth.
So Micky, you're our guest tonight, and you'll be our guest again later in the season. What are your reflections?
Well, several thoughts are going through my mind right now. And I love that this is not a one-time event, but that we're taking our time through the Lenten season, because I feel like, I grew up, like I had my own conversion experience in the evangelical church, in a little Southern Baptist church in Knoxville, Tennessee. And, we talked about Easter a lot, but there wasn't a lot of talk before that. Right. And then later in my journey, I became Anglican for a while, and there was a lot of focus on the seasons of the church calendar. And so being actually able to stick with these seasons and being able to spend some time in Lent, in that time of kind of anticipation or waiting, and not even knowing what we're waiting for, right? Like, because we know that Easter is coming, we can have a different posture to it. But I kind of like to see if I can play with my mind a little bit and not know Easter is coming. Right? Because that's part of it, right? Like if we actually put ourselves in that in the position maybe of like the disciples, right? They didn't know Easter was coming, right? So I like, or the average person on the street, you know, in
Mm-hmm.
Jesus's time wouldn't have known Easter is coming. So I like even starting with this domination story, because you're like, we are not always talking to people who know that resurrection is coming or is an option, that there is a seventh story. People are still wandering through the other 6 stories and don't know that it's coming. So it's lovely to actually remember that not everybody's come to that idea yet. And that some days we don't even have that idea yet.
Yeah.
You know, we fall back into just going to hell with it. It must just be these 6 stories.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that came to me as you were talking, Brian, is so a place that I spend a lot of time is South Africa. And there is this a Zulu word that is used as a greeting that is sawubona. And sawubona means hello, but it's a deeper word than just hello. It is, it's I see you, and I see you, and I see the people that came before you. I see your ancestors. And the way I imagine it, is as if your ancestors, the people from your community, are all standing behind you as I see you. And as you identify yourself, when you say hello to someone, essentially what you're also doing, especially if you don't know them, is asking them to identify themselves. And then as you do see them, the answer is Yebo Sabona. You're acknowledging who they are. So even this question, when Jesus is asking, who do people say I am? And they're answering that. They're putting Jesus in a context. They're having to decide their relationship to Jesus, right? That question asks, essentially, not only is Jesus saying, who do you say I am, but is saying, okay, so who does that mean you are? So I think that in this domination story, if we're talking also about the Jesus story, is when we stand back and look at the Jesus story and think about who we are in relation to Jesus. If we're going to have Jesus in a domination story, that's why we can have a Christianity that's all about who's in charge, who has the most power, Jesus as Lord. And by that, we mean this Lord that somehow will strike everything down and will take over everything for us. And, you know, not like Jesus with a little kid, you know, playing with a little kid in the dirt, right? Because it depends on which story we're placing Jesus in.
Yes.
So we have the opportunity to re-examine who we say Jesus is, who we are in relationship to Jesus. What are the relationships of all of us in the story to each other? Are there people that are in and people that are out? And you know, are we bowing to power or following power? Or do we only have power because we follow Jesus? Or is there some other relationship than who's the boss or who's going to win and who's going to lose?
Something that comes up for me when you're speaking there, Micky, is, you know, when I was growing up in the church experience, I grew up in, I don't think anyone ever questioned the possibility that Jesus might not have known he was going to get resurrected. Right? And that, you know, in some sense, if you know that everything's going to be fine on the other side, that does change your perspective on the suffering you're going through in that moment. And to turn to the question of making connections between this theme and current events, between popular culture, our own experience and our own lives, I suppose I'd want to mention there has been in the air a lot of fear lately. And I think, you know, it's certainly arguable that the root of all fear is the fear of death. And that all fear that we experience is somehow related to the fear of death. And that's one of the reasons why the people who seem most free of fear are the ones who've made the cleanest peace with their own deaths. Now, having said that, it's not about moral perfection. And I heard about someone who would be considered a great spiritual master who nearly died recently, and he said, "Let me tell you, it wasn't like what I expected it to be like. I was fighting it. I was panicking, And so, you know, it is good for us to give each other the benefit of the doubt. It's good for us to allow ourselves to continue to have our imperfections, even as we go through a season like Lent, which, at least for me, is a crystallization of this fear of death and this fear of this kind of low-lying dread that I think a lot of folk have experienced lately, because so many things have changed so fast. Technology has outstripped the pace of the evolution of the human mind to catch up with it. Thus far, I don't think that's going to be permanent. I think that something appears to be happening to humanity that's kind of like an initiation, that the crises we face, wherever you are on the political spectrum, however you define the emergencies that we seem to be facing, might actually wake us up to deepen love of neighbor, deepen our devotion to love as service, to deepen the notion that our lives are actually supposed to involve a kind of death. All spiritual wisdom invites people to do something like, in the words of Jesus, to take up our cross and follow. And it's not to follow into torture or into martyrdom, unless that's what happens to occur in your life. And for most of us, that's not what happens. But all of us are invited to see our lives as being part of a bigger whole, not an individualistic, career-based, selfish ambition, and certainly not an opportunity to dominate others, but an opportunity to lead through service. So I find some source of comfort in the notion that a healthy appreciation of death can be good for us,
Yeah.
Micky, I was struck when you talked about how we can actually resituate Jesus in the domination narrative. And I think that's exactly what happened in Western Christianity. We kind of couldn't handle Jesus as the liberator from domination. And so we domesticated him and found a way to tell his story so that he kind of reinforced, that whole thing. We did it through atonement theories. We did it through, I think, misinterpreting the book of Revelation as if it were a prophecy that Jesus might have been a nice guy the first time he came, but when he comes back, he's gonna make some people bleed. And and this resituating, trying to go back during the season of Lent, slowing down enough to imagine Jesus as actually a liberating figure who, at a young age, as often happens with kind of revolutionary figures, at a young age, they see through the domination. You think of St. Francis not being impressed by all the wealth of his father, and St. Francis not being, before he was a saint, anybody knew he was going to be a saint, not being impressed with the Pope and all the rest, just getting on with his work of caring for the poor. You think of Gandhi, you think of Dr. King, you think of Desmond Tutu, you think of Nelson Mandela. So many people who had the courage, they saw the domination systems around them, and they just stopped giving them their consent, and they stopped believing their story. And I think, as you said, Gareth, there is a lot of fear right now here in America. A lot of folks are afraid that we're losing democracy and sliding into domination. And we can all imagine a whole lot of scenarios where things get, we feel like they've already gotten worse, but they could get worse, so much worse still. And at a time like this, we have to not be willing to, we can't fall asleep because domination is always there, ready to rear its head. But we can't let that story be the only one, the one that intimidates us and the one we react against.
So we have these 4 questions that some of us have been using for a period of time now that try to evoke what true shelter can really be like. We're all familiar with the idea that in order to survive, human beings need food, water, air, and shelter, but we tend not to define shelter beyond four walls and a roof. If you're living in Western culture, and in some other cultures, you might not even have a wall and a roof. And these are questions that have emerged over time that have been really helpful. And we're going to ask them of each other. And those of you who are listening in, I encourage you to ask these questions of yourselves. And if you want to type some of your responses to them, we might be able to read some of them as well. The first question, and I'll answer the first question first, just to kind of model it, and then we'll work our way around. Is what's bringing you life at the moment? And what's bringing me life at the moment? I'll limit myself to one thing. It's people who are showing me that despite the fear and despite the struggle, and maybe even because of the struggle, let's not preoccupy ourselves too much with fear. Let's just commit ourselves to the common good. And I'm thinking of one person in particular who's got a very strong, clear appreciation of the challenges in the world today. And he's saying, I don't think too much about fear and hope. What I think about is what can I get good at doing that can serve the common good? And then I try to spend more of my day getting good at doing that thing than I devote in my day to fear or even trying to find hope. That's what's bringing me life is people who are showing me the way. Micky, what's bringing you life?
What's bringing me life right now is dancing and singing. I have been a dancer my whole life, but I've recently found a studio near me, and I dance as many times a week as I can. And it's really, really lovely to both have women who are farther along than me and women who are coming behind me who, we all cheer each other on and get sweaty and disgusting and challenge each other. And it's just been amazing. And then the singing, I have been, when I give talks recently, I've been talking a lot about the life of Fannie Lou Hamer, a civil rights activist who literally gave her life. She was a sharecropper who picked cotton from the time she was a little girl and didn't even know she had the right to vote or should have the right to vote until civil rights workers came to her, a little church in Rouville, Mississippi, where she lived. And as soon as she found out she should be able to vote, she started organizing other people to vote. And she's known for singing This Little Light of Mine. And so I try and get people to sing it with me all the time. And it's just so great because it's one of those songs that people kind of lose the performative aspect pretty quickly because it's a childhood song for many of us. And so it just changes the air in the room to get people to sing together, and they remember it and they plug in. And so just that kind of singing together, and so much good music is out right now that it's just, I find myself singing a lot, and that's bringing me a lot of life.
Lovely. And folks who are listening in, please comment with what's bringing you life. Brian, what about you?
Well, my honest answer is very simple and somewhat non-dramatic, but where I live in Florida, I have 10 mango trees on my property. And, mangoes are pretty amazing. Mango season comes June, July, August, but we're just in the blossom season right now. And so every day I go out and walk through my yard and see how the blossoms are called panicles, how the panicles are coming out a little more than yesterday, or how this one's, finished. And now there's a couple little berries of fruit that will do mangoes later. And, I guess life and just the miracle of life and our version of the changing of seasons that happens with that brings me a lot of life. And I know for folks who live farther up north, it's a little hard to relate to mangoes, but the, there are signs of the changing of seasons everywhere. Someone was just telling me that they had 12 inches of snow on their blooming crocuses. So knowing that those crocuses are there, is the same thing.
Mm-hmm. So the second of these four questions, we call them the porch circle questions, because of the kind of one of the hosting entities for the seventh story is the Porch Magazine, which you can find at theporchmagazine.com. The second question is, what's draining or challenging you? And for me, I would say, I mean, there's a number of things, but the primary one is the panic in the way that some stories are being told very loudly, particularly in the news media. I go to the gym fairly regularly, and I cannot for the life of me figure out why an institution dedicated to health has a bank of televisions in front of the ellipticals and the treadmills, in which another institution that, having worked in the media and having dear friends in the media, many of whom are ethical and good journalists, I do think it's still arguable that the mainstream news media may at least have some competing interests alongside its desire to spread good health and goodwill and an emotionally and psychologically integrated vision of reality. So in other words, it's when we tell the story about the world that lacks context, and we preoccupy ourselves with spectacular headlines that are usually about awful things, but we don't talk about context, trend lines, how these things fit into a wider picture, and frankly, how we can prevent them from happening again in the future. So I'd say it's decontextualized panic is draining me. We'll go the other direction this time, Brian. What's challenging or draining you?
Church conflict and trivia. I'll have lunch tomorrow with a friend of mine who's a Methodist minister, and of course, the Methodist Church has just gone through a big trauma. For some people, it's a trauma. For many of us who care about LGBTQ people being treated as equals. So, but the interesting thing about that is so many people in the Methodist Church are just handling this courageously and inspiringly. Meanwhile, I have another pastor friend who's dealing with people who are just, what's this? She's being stoned by marshmallows. Just trivial things that people complain about and all the rest. That drains me some.
Micky, while you're getting ready to respond, we've had a couple of comments. Paul Fraser says, what brings me life are the children who visit me every Sunday where I lead worship. And Gwen Stratton says, reading is always giving me life. That and waiting for spring. Gwen is disappointed that you wanted to talk about mangoes when there's 6 inches of snow in her yard. And Ann Coble, my friend Ann Coble in Nashville, says, reading also gives me life. Those of you who feel like you're getting life given to you by reading, there are two particular books that we encourage you to read at the moment. One's called Corey and the Seventh Story, and the other's called The Seventh Story, and you can get them both at theseventhstory.com. There you go.
Happen to have one right there.
And
he was reading it right before we started.
You can order them. They're also available for whatever you can afford if the cover price is outside your budget at the moment. So Micky, what's challenging or draining you?
I think what's challenging is just the realities of everyday life and how it's totally a cliche, but bad things happening to good people. I just know so many people dealing with cancer and struggling to put kids through college, and friends of mine who it seems to be hit after hit after hit. Myself as a mom, just when I think I've kind of got it down in one stage, everybody has another birthday. I have no idea how to raise them. None. So it's plus you just have, and then you have the headlines, right? So it's like, how we desperately need each other for this life, but it can seem so overwhelming by the end of the day that you can't even pick up the phone to call somebody and tell them that you need to talk to them. So I'm on this quest for deep community and connection with one another, and it feels sometimes challenging to even reach out for that.
Thank you. It's whenever these two questions get asked, I always feel like they're two sides of a coin, because the second question often results in me feeling life welling up inside me around how I can connect more with the vulnerability of another person. So thank you for that. The third question, and I'm seeing more comments about people are really enjoying their veggie and flower gardens, especially if they're in Florida. And there's a number of folk who are finding negativity in the culture and divisiveness, particularly within faith communities, to be challenging. The third question is about purpose for the common good. And this comes from a place where I've really come to believe that each of us has a particular gift for the world that's connected to our particular wound. And there's a lot of good psychology behind this. And we can help each other to get clear and discerning. What's my sense of calling toward the common good? And it is often to do with healing something within myself. And so I grew up in a society in Northern Ireland where obviously there was violent civil conflict, and there was major social division and a lot of trauma. And so it shouldn't surprise anybody that what I feel really called to is peace building and conflict resolution and violence reduction in the world. And a lot of that comes from the place of, I experienced more of it when I was younger, and I don't like it. I don't like violence. I think conflict can be creative, but we've got to find ways to be conscious in facilitating conflict into becoming something creative that doesn't harm people. So the question is, how is your sense of purpose showing up in your life? Your sense of purpose for the common good. And for me, that's about storytelling regarding what is the bigger picture. And when people are experiencing the panic and the dread and the terror, I want to be a listener. And I also want to try to offer reframes when the reframe is more true than the panic. And I put it simply, most of us are unconsciously living stories that are neither true nor helpful. And so the first two questions we should ask of any story we tell is, well, first of all, the question should be, what story am I telling? And that's one that most of us never get initiated into even asking that question. And the second question then should be, is it true? And if the answer is no, it's not true, well, then that's enough of a reason to change it. If the answer is it's partly true, then we might want to ask, well, what would a truer version of it be? And then the third question is it helpful? And I keep coming back to this one. This is how my purpose is showing up. We hear a lot these days of this phrase, now more than ever, right? We've all heard now more than ever. People use it in fundraising letters. People use it in the media. Politicians use it. I understand where it's coming from. The reframe that has awoken in me is let's abandon that phrase. First of all, it implies that the suffering that's happening today is worse than any suffering that's ever happened before. And there are certainly people who are suffering at the moment. There's no doubt about that. I think a more helpful, a truer phrase would be, for such a time as this. That we're here. We didn't choose this moment. We didn't choose this music, or as Stephen King says, we didn't choose the sounds around us, but they are the sounds that we've been given. So let us dance with those sounds. Sometimes it's a tricky dance, and sometimes it's a dangerous dance, and sometimes it's a joyous dance. Moving beyond now more than ever into for such a time as this might help us shake off some of the unnecessary suffering that we bring to ourselves. So that's what's showing up for me. And I'll tell you, it shows up every single morning because I wake up sometimes with the dread and the panic and the fear that anybody else is feeling. And I have to, you know, I pray and I invite friends to help me through this, and I breathe. And some days I'm just stuck in it, but often I'm not. And it's thanks to shelters like these. So Micky, how's your sense of purpose for the common good showing up?
I continue to lean into who I am as a doula. I used to be a birth and postpartum doula and help parents bring new life into the world in the form of a baby. And now I help people birth more love, justice, and shalom into the world. And it really is in some of the same ways that I would help people have a baby, that I would accompany people on that journey. So whether that means helping people acquire the information that they need to make decisions, whether that's emotional support, sometimes it is truly physical support of a hug or an arm around. Sometimes it's relational support, connection with another person, or conflict resolution. And so I just keep leaning into that doula role and encouraging other people to lean into that doula role, because one of the most beautiful things about being a doula is actually helping other people support the person who's birthing something at the moment. And so we're all kind of going through our own journeys in that way. The birth journey is a lot like the hero's journey, right? Where you have to go down into the depths and come back up and have that, you know, that journey through the darkest and come back out. And so we're all kind of dueling each other in a way through that. And so part of what I do is actually help other people assume that role. And then also accept that role, right? Like, actually, how do you accept the help from somebody else who's saying, actually breathe with me right now, or sit down and have a glass of water, or, you know, like, that's the kinds of things we have to remember right now. Like you were saying, Gareth, your friends that will help you breathe, right? And pray. So sometimes what you need is someone to say, actually, you just need to breathe right now, drink a glass of water. Have you eaten anything today? And remind you that you need those things to get through as well.
Brian.
I'll just, I know we're running short on time, so I'll just say, for me, I have to balance the public things that I do, writing, speaking, with very private things, caring for my family, being involved as a citizen in my local region. And so the balance of those things is good.
So the last question that we ask is, having heard what we've heard, how can we help each other? And I'm going to name here, there's a question that's been asked by one of our participants here. And I'm going to ask this question and ask Brian and Micky to have 1 or 2 sentences max as a response to this person. His name is J. Fee, who says, I cannot understand the Old Testament. The story, the way I learned or read it, seems not to fit any God or reality now. It's all about war and other forms of violence and fear. I studied it for years, but I'm no longer interested. What am I missing? How can we help J. Fee with that question?
You know, it's ancient literature. And I approach it in a very different way than I did when I was an evangelical. You know, and it's something that it's okay to leave it alone for a while. It's okay. It's okay to leave it alone for the rest of your life, actually. I don't care. God doesn't care. Like, if you never want to read any of it again, it's cool. There's no pressure. And then if you become curious about it and you want to get back to it, it'll still be there. It's okay.
I think the only thing I'd add is, if you keep coming back for these next 6 weeks, hopefully you'll start to see maybe a different way of looking at it.
Mhm.
So
So as we move toward wrapping up, Gwen Gustafson Zook has said, for such a time as this, to enjoy and nurture inclusive, contemplative community.
Mm.
And I think that's what we're attempting here. We're doing it through technology that we're moderately familiar with. And that's one of those pieces that, you know, it's the both and of the current moment, because, you know, you can find lots of examples of how technology is terrible and it's wrecking the world. And then you can find lots of examples of how technology as a tool is bringing people together and connecting us with love and with the ecosystem. And it's a beautiful thing to spend some time on a Tuesday night connecting with you, my friends, and with all of you who've been listening in. We're going to do this each of the following 6 Tuesdays, and there's a daily email that you can sign up for if you go to the7thstory.com. All the information is there, and we'd love to have you continue to be on this journey together with us. Brian, I'll leave it to you to close us.
well, when I'll blow this candle out as a reminder to us now that the light that we have shared together, we want to now carry inside of ourselves wherever we go this week until we meet again next week.
Amen. Ashe. May it be so.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Peace be with you. See ya.
Bye.